Her neighbors made fun of her for storing drinking water in barrels in the basement. In winter, everyone had problems with water. No one connected this with her strange decision, until something happened that changed everything. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments which city you are watching from. Winter did not arrive in that region with ceremony. It came the way it always did, gradually at first, with mornings that lingered longer in gray light and nights that hardened the ground before anyone was ready to admit that the season had turned. The settlement lay in a shallow basin between low ridges, far enough from any major route that visitors were rare once the snow set in. A cluster of cabins stood scattered along the frozen course of a narrow stream that twisted through the valley like a scar, dependable in summer, unreliable the moment frost took hold. For half the year, life there was shaped less by ambition than by endurance. People did not measure success in profit or growth, but in whether the fire lasted through the night and whether the water they drank did more harm than good. The climate was the kind that taught patience through discomfort. Snow came early and stayed late, but worse than the cold itself were the constant shifts that followed it. One week, the air would lock everything in ice, hard and clean, only to soften again when a warm wind rolled down from the hills, carrying moisture that turned snow into slush and ice into slick pools of meltwater. Then the temperature would plunge again, sealing whatever contamination had crept in beneath a fresh layer of frozen silence. These cycles repeated themselves all winter, sometimes several times a month, and every year they left the same quiet damage behind. Water had always been the settlement's unspoken weakness. In summer, the stream ran clear enough, fed by snowmelt from higher ground. Wells were shallow and unreliable, prone to clouding after heavy rain. Most families gathered what they could in the warmer months, filling barrels and casks when the water was still moving and storing them for the long season ahead. Once winter came, the stream slowed and then stopped altogether, trapped beneath ice thick enough to bear weight. Digging through it was laborious and risky, and no one did it unless desperation forced their hand. Tradition dictated that water should be stored outside. Barrels were lined up along the north walls of cabins or tucked beneath crude lean-tos, where the sun reached them less often. The reasoning was simple and had been passed down without much question. Cold, people believed, kept water clean. Ice was seen as purity made visible, a solid guarantee that nothing harmful could survive within it. A barrel frozen hard was inconvenient, but it was also trusted. You could chip away at it, melt what you needed, and drink without worry. Or so people told themselves. In practice, the reality was harsher. A barrel frozen solid was a useless thing until someone spent hours breaking ice and burning precious fuel to turn it back into liquid, and rarely did it stay frozen cleanly. During the inevitable thaws, the top layers melted first, collecting dust, ash from chimneys, animal droppings, and whatever else the wind carried through the settlement. When the cold returned, all of it was locked back inside. People did not think of bacteria in precise terms, but they understood illness. They knew that certain winters brought more stomach sickness than others, that children grew weak and feverish without clear cause, that old people faded faster once the snow set in. They blamed the cold, the darkness, the long confinement indoors. Few thought to blame the water itself. It was simply accepted that winter brought a measure of sickness with it. Pain in the belly, days spent bent over buckets or lying motionless under blankets, sudden weakness that made even small tasks exhausting. These things were endured with resignation. When someone fell ill, neighbors brought soup and advice. Boil the water longer, they said. Add a bit of spirits to it. Let it freeze again, as if that would somehow cleanse what had already taken hold. No one questioned the method that had always been used, because to do so would have meant admitting that the foundation of their daily survival was flawed. The woman who lived at the edge of the settlement noticed the pattern more clearly than most. Her cabin stood slightly apart from the others, not because she wished to isolate herself, but because it had been built on the only patch of ground that drained well enough to avoid spring flooding. The place was modest, a single-room structure with a low ceiling and a small cellar beneath it, dug long ago for storing root vegetables and little else. She had lived there for years, long enough to see the cycle repeat itself without fail. She was not known for speaking much at gatherings. Her presence in the settlement was quiet, almost unobtrusive, and that suited her. She had learned early that opinions offered too freely often returned as obligations. Instead, she observed. She watched which families fell sick first after the first thaw, which recovered quickly, and which did not. She noticed how the smell of water changed in certain barrels after weeks of freezing and melting, how a faint cloudiness appeared long before anyone admitted that something was wrong. She remembered a winter when a neighbor's child had grown dangerously ill after drinking from a barrel that had been chipped open and refrozen more times than anyone could count. The child survived, but the memory remained with her, sharp and unresolved. Cold did not frighten her. She understood it. Cold slowed things, preserved them, held decay at bay. What unsettled her was instability, the constant shift between states, the way water was forced from solid to liquid and back again without control or protection. She had once overheard an old traveler mention that water, kept in cool, dark places, often lasted longer than water exposed to open air, even if that air was cold. At the time, the comment had meant little. Years later, it returned to her with unexpected clarity. As autumn deepened, she began preparing in a way that drew quiet attention. While others hauled barrels to the edges of their homes, she dragged hers inside. One by one, she lowered them into the cellar beneath her cabin, maneuvering them carefully down the narrow steps. The work was slow and punishing, and more than one neighbor paused to watch, shaking their heads in disbelief. Some laughed outright, offering jokes she did not respond to. Others warned her, half in jest and half in concern, that she was inviting rot and sickness into her home. She listened without arguing. Argument required energy better spent elsewhere. She knew that if she explained her reasoning, it would be dismissed as theory or fear. People trusted what they could see and what they had seen. All their lives was ice. So she worked in silence, sealing her barrels, cleaning them thoroughly, and arranging them in the darkest part of the cellar, where the air remained cool even when the sun warmed the surface above. As the first hard frosts arrived, the settlement settled into its winter posture. Fires burned longer each night. Barrels outside grew stiff with ice. The stream vanished beneath a white crust. Inside her cabin, the woman drew water from a barrel that remained liquid and clear. She drank it cautiously at first, expecting some sign that her decision had been foolish. None came. The water tasted the same as it always had, if not better, free of the metallic edge that sometimes accompanied melted ice. She did not announce this to anyone. There was no need. Winter had only just begun, and experience had taught her that it was not the first weeks that revealed the truth of a season, but the long stretch that followed. The real test would come later, when the thaw returned, and the settlement once again trusted the false cleanliness of frozen barrels. Until then, she waited, listening to the wind press against the walls of her cabin, aware that her choice had already set her apart, whether she wished it or not. The first weeks of winter passed without incident, and that in itself unsettled the woman more than open disaster would have. Calm often bred complacency in the settlement. When nothing went wrong, people assumed that nothing ever would. The barrels outside the cabins froze clean and hard after the early snows, and the familiar creaking sound of ice expanding against wood became part of the background noise of daily life. Men chipped away at the tops of their barrels when they needed water, melting chunks on their stoves and congratulating themselves on having prepared well. The woman watched all of this from a distance, continuing her own routines without comment. Inside her cellar, the air held steady. When she descended the steps with a lamp in hand, the flame burned calmly, unaffected by drafts or sudden changes in temperature. The barrels stood where she had placed them, their surfaces dry, their lids sealed tight. She checked them often, not because she expected failure, but because vigilance had become habit. Each visit reassured her. The water remained clear, the smell unchanged, the surface unbroken by ice. Her neighbors noticed, of course. In a place that small, difference was impossible to hide. The absence of barrels along her cabin wall was remarked upon first with confusion, then with amusement. Someone joked that she must be afraid her water would run away in the night. Another suggested that she was hoarding it underground like treasure. The comments were not cruel, at least not at first. They carried the casual tone of people confident in their own correctness. Eventually, curiosity gave way to direct questioning. One afternoon, as she returned from the woodpile with an armful of split logs, a man from the nearest cabin stopped her. He asked plainly why she had moved her water inside. She answered just as plainly, saying that she did not want it freezing and thawing all winter. He laughed and shook his head, explaining that freezing was exactly what kept water clean. He spoke with the authority of repetition, repeating what he had been told and what he had always believed. When she did not argue, his amusement faded into mild irritation, as if her silence itself were a challenge. Others were less restrained. A woman she had known for years warned her that water stored in a cellar would go bad, that it would grow stagnant and foul, that darkness and stillness were invitations to decay. Someone else claimed that damp air would seep into the barrels, that mold would grow unseen until it was too late. Each warning was delivered with confidence, often accompanied by a story from somewhere else, some other winter, some other place, where a mistake like this had supposedly ended badly. She listened to every word and nodded when it seemed appropriate. What she did not do was defend herself. Defense required convincing others, and she had learned that conviction rarely survived contact with tradition. Instead, she focused on her preparations, refining them quietly. She cleaned the cellar floor again, laying down boards to keep the barrels elevated. She checked the seals on each lid, replacing one that showed the slightest gap. She adjusted the placement so that no barrel touched a wall, allowing air to circulate gently around them. Each action was deliberate, guided by observation rather than fear. At night, when the fire burned low and the cabin settled into the familiar sounds of cooling wood and shifting earth, doubt crept in despite her resolve. She had gone against what everyone else considered common sense. If she was wrong, the consequences would not be abstract. Bad water would mean sickness, weakness, and isolation in a season that already punished those things harshly. There would be no one to blame but herself. She thought of winters past, of how quickly a small illness could become something serious when roads were impassable and help was days away. The weight of that responsibility pressed on her more heavily than the cold ever had. What steadied her was not stubbornness, but clarity. She understood what she was trying to prevent. Water left outside was never truly at rest. It changed state constantly, absorbing whatever the environment offered during each brief thaw. Freezing did not purify it. It merely paused whatever processes were already underway. By keeping the water below ground, she removed it from those cycles. The cellar's stable temperature meant there was no daily stress placed on the barrels, No expansion and contraction. No opportunity for contaminants to work their way inside through microscopic openings. Darkness prevented growth. Stillness preserved what had been clean to begin with. As winter deepened, the settlement's conversations shifted. Early confidence gave way to the familiar complaints about cold fingers, frozen tools, and the endless labor of maintaining fires. Fetching water became a chore that people dreaded. Barrels were frozen deeper now, and breaking ice required more time and more fuel. Some days, the surface ice refroze so quickly that it trapped slush and debris beneath it. People noticed the change in taste, but said little, trusting that boiling would solve what they could not see. The woman's routine remained unchanged. Each morning, she descended into the cellar, filled her containers, and returned to the warmth of the cabin without ever stepping into the snow. The water poured smoothly, clear and cold without the bite of ice. She boiled it when she could, out of caution rather than necessity, but even unboiled it had caused her no trouble. Her health remained steady. She did not suffer the stomach pains that others dismissed as unavoidable, nor the lingering fatigue that often followed them. This contrast did not go unnoticed forever. A neighbor who had laughed at her earlier stopped by one evening, ostensibly to borrow something, and lingered longer than necessary. His eyes drifted toward the cellar door as they talked. He asked casual questions about her winter preparations, about whether she had enough firewood, whether the cold bothered her more this year than last. She answered without elaboration. When he finally left, she sensed that curiosity had replaced ridicule, though pride still kept it from becoming respect. Outside, winter tightened its grip. Snow piled higher against the cabins, and the path between homes narrowed into hard-packed trenches. The stream remained silent beneath its frozen cover. The settlement had entered the phase of the season that separated preparation from endurance. This was when mistakes began to show themselves, slowly at first, then all at once. In the quiet of her cabin, the woman understood that her choice had already set events in motion. She had not intended to prove anything to anyone. Her goal had been simpler, more personal. But in a place where survival depended on shared assumptions, even a private deviation carried consequences. Whether those consequences would be vindication or regret was something only the coming weeks could decide. As she closed the cellar door one night and banked the fire for sleep, she sensed that the true test of her decision was no longer theoretical. Winter was settling in for real, and soon it would demand answers from everyone. By the time the deepest part of winter arrived, the settlement had settled into a strained rhythm that felt both familiar and increasingly fragile. The early confidence people carried into the season had thinned, worn down by weeks of labor that yielded diminishing returns. Snow lay in thick layers against the cabins, pressing against doors and walls as if trying to force its way inside. Paths that had once been wide enough for two people to pass now narrowed into single tracks, carved by boots and sled runners. The air itself seemed heavier, weighed down by cold and exhaustion. The freeze-thaw cycles grew more violent as the season progressed. A brief warming would soften the snow just enough to turn it into slush, which crept into every crack and hollow before the temperature dropped again and locked it into ice. Barrels outside bore the scars of this process. Wood staves warped and split, metal rims loosened, and lids no longer fit as tightly as they had in autumn. People compensated as best they could, piling snow around the bases for insulation or stacking boards over the tops. But these were small defenses against a larger problem they did not fully understand. Fetching water became an ordeal that dominated each day. Men rose early to chip away at ice before it hardened completely, their breath hanging thick in the air as they swung axes and iron bars against frozen surfaces. Women tended stoves that burned hotter than they should have, simply to melt enough water for cooking and washing. Fuel that should have lasted weeks vanished in days, consumed not for warmth, but for the basic act of turning ice back into liquid. The water that resulted was often cloudy, carrying a faint smell that people ignored because acknowledging it would have meant admitting vulnerability. Illness followed quietly, as it always did. One household at first, then another. A child complained of stomach pain and was put to bed with hot cloths and weak tea. An older man grew listless, unable to keep food down. These incidents were spoken of in low voices, as if naming them too clearly might invite worse. The explanation remained the same. It was the cold, people said, the long nights, the strain of winter. No one wanted to believe that the very thing they relied on to survive was undermining them. Against this backdrop, the woman's routine continued unchanged. Each morning, she descended into her cellar and drew water that flowed freely, unbroken by ice. The act remained almost startling in its simplicity. There was no need to break, melt, or strain. The water filled her container smoothly, cold but not numbing, clear enough that the lamplight shone through it without distortion. She carried it back upstairs and went about her day, aware that what she was doing had quietly become an exception to the rule everyone else was living under. She conserved fuel without meaning to. Because she did not have to melt ice, her fire burned for warmth rather than necessity. Because she did not spend hours wrestling frozen barrels, she had more energy for other tasks. The difference showed in small ways at first. She did not complain of the persistent fatigue that others accepted as inevitable. Her sleep was steadier. Her appetite remained intact. These things might have gone unnoticed if winter had not been so unforgiving elsewhere. The contrast sharpened when a series of storms swept through the valley in quick succession. Snow fell heavily for days, piling so high that some cabins were nearly buried on one side. Winds drove fine ice into every exposed surface, tearing at tarps and coverings meant to protect supplies. When the storms passed, temperatures plunged, sealing the settlement under a shell of hard-packed snow and ice that resisted even the strongest tools. Outside, barrels were now more than frozen. They were entombed. People grew desperate. Some attempted to bring chunks of ice indoors to melt, tracking slush and dirt across their floors. Others resorted to collecting snow and boiling it, an inefficient process that yielded little water for the amount of fuel consumed. The taste was flat and unsatisfying, and no one pretended it was safe. Children cried from thirst and hunger, their bodies struggling under the combined strain of cold and illness. It was during this period that the first truly serious incident occurred. A family living 2 cabins away from the woman fell ill almost simultaneously. The youngest child's fever rose quickly, accompanied by vomiting that left him weak and unresponsive. The parents did what they could, boiling water and forcing small sips between bouts of sickness, but nothing stayed down. Fear spread faster than any illness. People gathered outside the cabin, offering advice and help that amounted to little more than shared worry. The woman watched from her doorway, understanding before anyone said it aloud that the problem was not a lack of care, but a lack of something far more basic. Clean water was the one thing no one had in sufficient quantity. She did not hesitate long. She fetched one of her smaller barrels from the cellar, one she had set aside for just such a contingency, and carried it through the snow to the neighboring cabin. Her arrival was met with surprise and confusion. Someone asked where she had gotten water that was not frozen. She answered simply that it had been stored inside. There was no time for debate. The barrel was opened, and cups were filled cautiously at first, then more freely as people realized that the water was clear, odorless, and immediately usable. The sick child drank without retching. the first real relief he had shown in days. Word spread quickly, as it always did in moments of crisis. People came not to accuse or mock, but to ask. How had she kept it from freezing? Why had it not spoiled? What had she done differently? She answered as honestly as she could, explaining the cellar, the preparation, the simple idea of stability. Some listened with intent focus. Others struggled, their understanding colliding with years of accepted belief. In the days that followed, the settlement's dynamic shifted in subtle but unmistakable ways. The woman's cabin became a point of quiet reference. People noticed that she was not sick, that her household moved through winter with less strain, that her water, drawn from below ground, remained unchanged even as theirs grew worse. Skepticism did not vanish overnight, but it weakened under the weight of evidence that could no longer be ignored. Winter wasn't finished with them yet. More storms came and more cold followed. But something had changed. Where there had been ridicule, there was now attention. Where there had been certainty, there was now doubt. The woman did not take satisfaction in this. Her concern had never been about proving herself right. It had been about enduring the season without sacrificing health or dignity. As she returned to her cellar each morning, drawing water that had become quietly precious, she understood that the settlement was beginning to face a truth it had avoided for generations. Survival depended not just on enduring the cold, but on understanding what quietly threatened them beneath it. The thaw came slowly, the way it always did, as if winter were reluctant to release its hold all at once. At first there were only signs, subtle enough that people noticed them without trusting them. Icicles grew longer during the day and shrank again at night. The snow on rooftops darkened, losing its clean white surface and taking on the dull sheen of water beneath a crust of ice. Paths that had been solid for months softened at the edges, turning treacherous underfoot. Everyone knew what this meant. Spring was approaching, but with it came a final test, one that had broken more than one household in the past. The woman watched these changes with a measured calm. She had been waiting for this phase of the season as much as she had dreaded it. Winter sickness was one thing, but the transition out of winter was often worse. As snow melted unevenly, water that had been trapped for months began to move again, carrying with it everything it had collected during the freeze. Barrels outside the cabins filled with slush and debris. Some collapsed under the strain, spilling their contents into the mud. Others held, but what they contained bore little resemblance to the clean water people remembered filling them with in autumn. Inside her cellar, nothing changed. The temperature remained steady. The barrels stood exactly as they had weeks before, their contents untouched by the chaos above. When she drew water, it was as clear as it had been at the start of winter, free of sediment or odor. She could have taken comfort in this privately, but the events of the past weeks had made privacy impossible. Too many people now knew where her water came from. Too many had relied on it during the worst of the cold to dismiss it as an oddity. The settlement began to change its behavior, not through proclamation or agreement, but through observation. People noticed that households which had relied most heavily on frozen barrels had suffered the most. Children who had been sick through much of the winter remained weak longer than expected. Older residents struggled to regain their strength. In contrast, those who had managed to supplement their supply with water from the woman's cellar, even occasionally, recovered faster. The connection was not stated outright at first, but it was understood. Conversations shifted in tone. Where once people had joked or warned her against storing water indoors, they now asked careful questions. How deep was the cellar? How cold did it stay? Did the water ever smell? Did she treat it in any way before storing it? She answered each question patiently, repeating herself when necessary, never embellishing her explanation. She emphasized preparation and consistency rather than cleverness. It was not a trick, she told them. It was simply a matter of keeping water out of the cycle of freezing and thawing. Some were slow to accept this. Tradition did not release its grip easily. A few argued that the winter had simply been worse than usual, that sickness came and went regardless of water storage. But these objections lacked conviction. The evidence had been lived, not theorized. People had felt the difference in their own bodies. They had seen it in their children. When the snow finally receded enough to expose the ground, the full extent of the damage became visible. Barrels left outside were stained with dark rings, where meltwater had pooled and refrozen again and again. Sediment coated the bottoms. In some, a sour smell rose as soon as the lids were lifted, forcing people to step back in disgust. Water that had once been trusted without question was now poured out onto the ground, wasted because it could not be risked. The woman did not comment on this. She did not point out what had gone wrong or remind anyone of earlier warnings. She simply continued as she always had, drawing water from her cellar and going about her work. Her restraint did more to convince people than any argument could have. There was no triumph in her demeanor, no sense that she had been waiting for others to admit their mistake. What mattered to her was that the settlement emerged from winter with fewer losses than it might have. As the ground softened, some of the men began digging. At first, it was only one household, the same family whose child had fallen dangerously ill during the worst of winter. They chose a spot close to their cabin and began excavating a small cellar, working carefully to keep the walls stable. Others watched, offering advice that was more tentative than before. When the pit grew deep enough to hold a barrel without freezing, interest spread. Soon, another household followed, then another. By early summer, the idea had taken root. Not everyone adopted it immediately, but enough did that it began to feel less like an anomaly and more like an option. People spoke of water storage in new terms, discussing temperature and cleanliness rather than simply cold. The settlement's habits adjusted gradually, shaped by memory of the winter that had just passed. The woman remained at the center of these changes without ever claiming that position. She helped when asked, explaining what she had learned through observation rather than instruction. She cautioned against shortcuts, emphasizing that preparation mattered as much as placement. Clean barrels, sealed lids, darkness, and stability were all necessary. Remove one element, she warned, and the system would fail. Her advice was practical, grounded in experience rather than theory, and that made it easier to accept. When summer fully arrived, and the stream began to run clear again, people filled their barrels as they always had. But this time, many carried them indoors instead of lining them up outside. Cellars once reserved for vegetables now held water as well. The sight was no longer strange. It had become part of the settlement's evolving understanding of survival. Looking back, some would later describe that winter as a turning point, not because it was the coldest or the longest, but because it forced a reconsideration of what people thought they knew. The woman's contribution was never recorded in any official way. There was no marker, no story embellished with heroism. Her influence lived instead in quieter outcomes. Fewer illnesses in the winters that followed. Less fear during the thaw. A shared awareness that danger did not always announce itself with drama. For her, the change brought a simple kind of satisfaction. Not pride, but relief. Relief that the lesson had been learned before it cost more lives. Relief that silence and patience had proven stronger than ridicule. As she descended into her cellar one evening, drawing water that would remain unchanged no matter what the weather did above, she reflected that survival often depended less on strength than on attention. The cold could be endured, hunger could be planned for, But water, taken for granted and misunderstood, demanded respect. And sometimes, the person who understood that best was the one least inclined to say so out loud. Before you go, if this story made you think differently about how people once survived with nothing but observation and common sense, take a moment to support the channel. Subscribe so you don't miss the next story, where we explore more real, practical solutions from the past that still matter today. Watch the next video on the channel to continue this journey, and if you know someone who would appreciate stories like this, share the video with them. It helps the channel grow and keeps these lessons alive.